Hey there, it's Mr. K. Welcome to the third lecture for AP Lit. Today we're going to identify and describe what specific textual details reveal about a character, or I guess I should say we're going to continue doing that. This lesson we're going to apply your knowledge of characterization to analyze a character's perspective. Right, so going that next step and not just understanding on a surface level what a character is like, but really using those details about a character or characters to analyze how they see the world or how they seem to see the world, at least from the perspective of us, the readers, right? We're looking at the world sort of through their eyes. So that's what we're going to try and do. All right, today's goals to understand what perspective is and how a character's perspective is impacted or how it's affected or changed in literature. And then to understand how perspective and characterization are actually related. So again, taking it that next step. All right. A quick disclaimer for this lecture. For this lecture to make sense today, you need to read The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. And if you're one of my students in class, you likely did that already. If I'm assigning this video to you, if you haven't, go ahead and hit pause. Find a copy of that story. It's easy to find online. It's easily accessible. The good thing is it's also very short. You can read the story in a few minutes, and but for today to really make any sense to you, you need to get the at least the story in your mind. All right. So if you need to pause, go ahead and do so. Okay, let's talk about perspective. You may have heard this story before, but just in case, let me tell it very quickly. And if you've heard it before, it's a good reminder. Imagine that there are 6 people, and they are all blind. All right. And, this story, I understand, it's 2022 and that, maybe this would be considered a little, uncouth to tell a story like this. But for the purposes of the story, you have 6 people. They are blind. Okay. They are walking along and they come across this thing. Now, we are able to see what this thing is. It's an elephant. Right? But they don't know. So this person on the top is kind of feeling the ear and is like, oh, I know what this thing is in front of all of us. It's a fan. This person over here is feeling the tusk and is like, no. It's not a fan. It's a spear. Right? And this person is feeling the trunk and is like, no, it's not a fan or a spear. It's a snake. This person is feeling the leg here. And is like, no, it's this tree. It's this, big steady tree. This person is feeling the side and it's like it's a wall. And this person is feeling the tail. It's like, no, it's a rope. You're all wrong. The purpose of the story to show that in a way, all 6 of these people are right. They're all wrong. It's not a fan or a spear or a snake or a tree or a rope or a wall. It's an elephant. But based on their perspective, based on what they are able to, what details they are able to gather, based on just touch, they're all making an educated guess that's actually pretty good, right? The way this ties into literature is that we, in a lot of ways, walk into a story or a poem or a novel or a play or a film, and we are blind in a lot of ways. And honestly, we're only shown what the author, or director or poet or whatever the case may be, wants us to see or hear, right? We only experience what they allow us, what they give us, right? So that's on a sort of like we, the reader, looking at a piece of literature. There's also within the literature itself, if you go into the actual literature, characters are sort of blind as well. They are saying things and doing things and thinking things based on the information they are given, right? And so you might see a character who's doing something and you're like, how can you possibly do that? You idiot. Don't walk in that room. What are you doing? Well, because you know something they don't, right? And so that's the idea. It's all about perspective, right? It's all about perspective. Perspective is all about how we see our world, and on the level of literature, how characters see theirs. How do they see their world, right? And what that allows us to do is not only understand, oh, Mrs. Mallard is this type of person in this story, but she seems to be this type of person, and here's why. And whoa, here's how she's changed over time. What I believe to be true about her is actually not true at all, right? And so that's how we get deeper into thinking through literature. Perspective, right? So what shapes perspective? There's four main things that we can look for. And you definitely want to make a note of this. But when we're talking about a character, we want to look at their background. We want to look at their environment. We want to look at their personality traits. And we want to look at their relationships, right? A lot of these you'll see kind of overlap, right? Someone's background will tie in with their environment. Their personality traits will tie into their background. Their relationships will tie into their environment. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of connection there. But if we look for kind of those four aspects, background, environment, personality traits, and relationships, we can get a really, really good idea of what a character's perspective is, right? And understand them on a deeper level. All right. So I want to talk about the story of an hour, right? So at this point, hopefully you've read the story. Again, if you haven't, you really have to pause the video and go read that story, The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. And what I want you to do in that story is I want you to look for Mrs. Mallard's details about Mrs. Mallard's background, her environment, her personality traits, and her relationships. And look for as many examples as you can related to those four things. Right? And then you can hit play on the video and continue on. Okay, so if you need to go read the story, go ahead and do that. And if you have already read the story, hit pause either way and go identify background, environment, personality traits, and relationships. Okay, go for it. Okay, and if you're back, so I wanted to just show you a couple examples. These are by no means all of the examples, and you probably came up with other ones. That almost always happens when I'm going through a piece in class. A student picks out something, and I'm like, interesting, I didn't really think about that. And they explain it. I'm like, that's fantastic. Let me just go through these four quotes and kind of tell you where I would categorize them, and again, maybe more than one box. Maybe each quote could fit in more than one place. But let's look at this. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. Okay. What does this say about Mrs. Mallard? She saw beyond this bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. Okay, this tells me a little bit of her background and kind of her environment. And I kind of highlighted especially important kind of words or phrases here, but if we're talking about this character, Mrs. Mallard, she's looking at years to come that would belong to her absolutely. That implies to me that she lives in an environment in which her life, her time is not her own, absolutely. If she's looking forward to that change, that means that it hasn't been like that. And she comes from, we can assume, she comes from a very strict, and I think the story makes it very clear that a very kind of strict, patriarchal background, right? And so she seems to. This quote tells me that in this moment, this bitter moment of losing her husband, she's actually looking forward and is like, "Hold on, my life could be my own." Huh? Right? Okay, that tells us about her perspective a lot. That that really reveals a lot about her background, her environment. Okay, down here, this is actually, I believe, her sister is talking to Mrs. Mallard. Um, yes, and so Louise is Mrs. Mallard, right? And her sister is saying to her, "Louise, open the door. I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill." Okay, um, we see this a couple times in the text. She does have this personality trait of she's uh, if she's going to make herself ill, that sounds like that's something that has happened before, and that the sister is aware of it being an issue, right? And you know, like I just picture her at the door, like banging on the door, trying to get in. It's like, don't do this, don't do this. You know, Louise, Mrs. Mallard, don't detach, don't disappear on me, don't, you know, um, don't don't back away. Let me in. Let me physically in the door, and then, even more so, let me, be with you during this hard time of learning that uh, supposedly your husband is dead, right? So, Mrs. Mallard is really characterized, I believe, as very weak, very frail. Very. It even says, like, I believe it says her heart is weak, right? And so that would be a personality trait. Yeah, that could also be sort of a relationship too. She has a sister who, in this moment, is trying to step in and take care of her. But okay, this next one, there would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. This really ties in strongly with the first one. But it's interesting. It's almost like this is like the perfect use of a semicolon, right? There's kind of two ideas that are sort of like two sides of the same coin. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. And that sounds really awful. But then you realize the second sentence here, she would live for herself. Oh, this isn't a bad thing, right? We get this news that Mrs. Mallard's husband has died. And if you're like me, when I first read the story, I assume, oh my gosh, that's awful. That's terrible, right? If something happened to me, if my wife, died and I got this terrible news, I would be inconsolable. And she actually has these thoughts of she would live for herself. This personality trait, there's this desire to be independent. There's this longing for independence that we didn't know was there in her, and she may not have even known was in there, right? And then the final, sorry, I knew the bell was going to ring. Sorry, those are the bells in my school here. Okay, last quote. He had only taken the time to assure himself. So this is the family kind of friend. He had only taken the time to assure himself of its truth, the death of the husband, by a second telegram, and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. This says something about relationships. Again, you have a family friend who is looking out for Mrs. Mallard. It also says something about her. He took several steps to make absolute certain that he would be the one to break the news to Mrs. Mallard, because again, she seems to be known as very weak, very frail, very brittle, easily broken, right? And if someone said, gave her the news and didn't do so in a very calm, gentle way, she would crack, right? The irony, of course, is that when she does get the news, we see her kind of detached. She's slumped in the chair. She disappears into her room. But what is she saying under her breath? She's saying, free, free, free. You're like, whoa. Oh, this Ms. Mallard, she's not upset about this. She's happy. She is looking forward to a future that belongs to her, right? Again, characterization is where we start with literature. Who are these people? What kind of people are they? And then the next step is perspective. Because of who they are as people, how does that affect how they understand the world, right? How does that affect the way that they experience life, right? And that's what's expected of us as readers if we want to understand literature more deeply, right? In the end, here's where we're really trying to get to. So if you're in my class, we've either done some of this or this is what we're doing next, which is like, okay, we want to take these ideas that are kind of floating around in our heads, and we need to be able to translate them into actual, like, here's writing. So I just wanted to read. I just came up with this example. This is me just describing Mrs. Mallard's perspective, and then I would challenge you, to try your own, right? Try your hand at putting into paragraph form what a character's perspective is. Try and actually explain that in writing. Okay, so here's what I came up with. Mrs. Mallard's perspective was defined not by herself, but by others. She walked through life under the care of others. Probably would have changed the word others. She is described as sickly, weak, fragile, and unable to care for herself. Mrs. Mallard's identity is completely enveloped in the character of others, most notably her husband. And yet, there's clearly more to her than this frail woman that is described. When we learn of her husband's supposed death, she repeatedly says, free, 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 as if she doesn't wish to be so heavily reliant on others. Mrs. Mallard desires to be free. It is only when she learns that her husband is in fact still alive, that the weaknesses she has been programmed by society to experience deal their final blow, it should say. All right, this is a draft. I'm fixing it as I go. The weaknesses, or the weakness deals its final blow, right? That's right. Okay, her husband is alive, and Mrs. Mallard falls over dead. It is only through a close reading of Mrs. Mallard's perspective that we understand that she did not indeed die from a, quote, joy that kills, like the story tells us, but from the prospect of returning home to her domestic cage. The story ends with a joy that kills. She's so happy to see her husband that she literally dies. We know from a close reading, we actually understand more about Mrs. Mallard than her closest friends and family. We understand, no. She died because she thought she was finally free. And then Mr. Mallard came back home. And usually that would be such incredible news. Oh my God, you're actually alive. No, for her, it kills her. It kills her. That's what deals its final blow in the end. Such a great story. My goodness. Short, to the point, and just so much going on as far as character and perspective and things like that. But that's just to give you an idea of kind of where we need to go. We need to go from reading a story, picking out details about characters, understanding their perspective, and then verbalizing, here's what a character's perspective actually is, and here's what it kind of looks like, and things like that. All right. Today's goals were to understand what perspective is, how a character's perspective is impacted, and finally, to understand how perspective and characterization are related. I hope this video helped. If it didn't, you can always, if you're my student, ask me in class, send me an email. And if I've never met you before, send me an email. My email address is on the YouTube channel. I'd be happy to help any student who needs it. All right. I'll see you next time. Thanks.